Right, so this is part 2 of chapter 9 on business ethics and sustainability. Let's go ahead and start talking about the 5 global problems. The first one is climate change, right? I'm sure you've all heard this term, right? What is climate change exactly? Climate change is changes in the Earth's climate caused by increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide and other pollutants produced by human activity. Freudian slip there, right? Harming the environment, human activity. The causes include burning fossil fuels, right? We've spoken about already. Increased emissions of nitrous oxides. This is also known as the greenhouse gases. And this all primarily, like they say, 75% comes from the fertilizers that we use in farming and agriculture. So those fertilizers emit these nitrous oxides, and then they get trapped in the atmosphere. We'll go through that further in this chapter, but just wanted to give you a little taste of what that is. We also talk about another cause of climate change is black carbon. So this is when we have huge fires, and the smoke from the fires then absorbs the heat, and that affects the climate overall. Deforestation, right? This is the cutting down of trees, which I've mentioned as well already so far in this chapter, a huge thing in Latin America. And then beef production, right? Who would have thought? But it is a big, big issue where the methane gas from the digestion of the cows and the general feed production has impacts on the environment. So that's why actually a lot of vegetarians have decided to not eat any beef because they feel it's also hurting the environment. Good. So the Convention on Climate Change is an international treaty that limits emissions of greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. And we'll talk about a handful of different conventions and organizations that are trying to help the environment. Let's go. Before I hop into that, I did want to talk a little bit about this treaty, the Convention of Climate Change, because it's a big one. It's from 1992 from the United Nations. But then a couple of years later, 5 years later, was the Kyoto Protocol. And this talks explicitly about the greenhouse gases. And why I bring that up is because the Kyoto Protocol, right, was such a big topic in the Trump administration, right? Because for the first time, the United States withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. Obviously, that's changing now with the Biden administration, but I wanted to give a little bit of background because it has been such a hot topic over the last 3 to 4 years. Another one that you'll see here in Los Angeles, there are those like mini billboards that you see on the streetlights. They talk about the Paris Agreement, and it's, unless you know what the Paris Agreement is, you won't necessarily understand those mini billboards because it just says like Paris 2021. What they're talking about is that there is a rise in average global temperatures, and we're trying to limit that. The Paris Agreement was created in 2015, but now there's been a bigger stress on it because these topics are coming up again and again, and also because we've changed administrations, and the Biden administration is much more into these types of things. So if you are driving along in West LA, I've seen them on Centinela or on Wilshire Boulevard, and I think they just say Paris 2020, and now you know what they're talking about. Good, let's hop on to the next slide. We'll talk about more protocols and more conventions further in this chapter. Let's talk about, okay, what is global warming, right? So I think most of you know, but if you don't, it's all about here where the sun, the infrared energy from the sun reflects off the Earth's surface and is trapped in the atmosphere by these greenhouse gases that are warming the surface. So this is the atmosphere, and these greenhouse gases here on the Earth, they include that carbon dioxide, the methane, nitrous oxide, and the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that I was just speaking about, which again, we'll get into some further detail in this chapter, but all these bad gases, they come from fertilizers, they come from cows, they come from hairspray cans, etc. We use these things, they float into the air, and then they create this layer in the atmosphere. And when the sun comes through, it creates this greenhouse effect. So if you understand what a greenhouse is, right, is a house made of glass, and so that the sun can come in and warm the space so that the plants can grow. But when we do this for the earth, we run into problems, right? Because the earth gets too hot. And that's right where we have all these climate changes, et cetera. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. Hopefully you already knew that before, but just to reiterate, right, it's these greenhouse gases that are moving into the atmosphere and then trapping the heat that comes from the sun. Great. Let's go ahead and move into the second global problem, which is ozone depletion. So this is a bluish gas composed of 3 bonded oxygen atoms. I know none of you took a lot of science. I took a lot of science, but still, it was a long time ago. But the idea, right, that we have these atoms, they float in a thin layer in the stratosphere between 9 and 28 miles above the planet. That's the ozone layer. That's decently far away. And again, the causes are these chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs, which you'll hear about. You'll see them printed on bottles, like when you go to the hardware store to buy certain types of chemicals or certain products, they'll say no CFCs because they want to tell you that you're not harming the environment by using these types of products. Now you know what they are. Manufactured chemicals formerly widely used as refrigerants, insulation solvents, and propellants in spray cans. And in 1987, world leaders negotiated the Montreal Protocol, agreeing to cut the CFC production. One of the cool things that came out of this Montreal Protocol was that a handful of beverage companies decided to change how they refrigerate their vending machines. So Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Red Bull were a handful where they now can use less CFCs. So if you go to a vending machine, many of you hopefully have seen an old vending machine versus a new vending machine. Mostly we have new ones these days because 1987 was a long time ago, but when you see an old vending machine, you can really tell that it's old, right? And that it's a totally different technology. And that how we refrigerate things is much, much better for the environment. Let's go ahead and move into the next one, resource scarcity. We spoke about this again briefly already in this chapter. We're going to talk about fresh water and arable land, really important things. So fresh water, I'm a huge water drinker, right? I live in California. I do a lot of yoga. I do a lot of sports. So I'm drinking a lot of water. And it's scary, right? That sometimes our water potentially might not be as clean or as plentiful as we need it to be. So here, only about 0.1% of the Earth's water is in lakes, rivers, and accessible underground supplies, and thus available for human use. So if anybody has a well in their house where they grew up, that is great water, but it's only about 0.1% of that can use a well. But fresh water, the good thing is renewable. That's great. So we can go out and we can get salt water and we can turn it into drinking water. But by the early 2010s, water shortages had already caused the decline of local economies and in some cases had contributed to regional conflicts. That's because we can't produce enough fresh water as much as we need to be drinking it. So a really scary part about how that all works when it comes to water. So we're using it faster than we can create it, in other words. Another one here, arable land. So this we see less of in present day, but I have to say I think the Bible, right? Because so many people were moving for land that they could farm and they could raise cattle on or raise livestock, etc. But they were consistently moving, right? Moses consistently moving. But that still happens, right, today, that people have to move so that and when we have less, I'll hop into the second point here, right, less arable land can lead to migration and civil unrest. A more current one from the Bible is the Dust Bowl, for example, from the 1930s, right? You've probably seen movies or heard about it, right? Where from Texas to Arkansas, there was just a lack of arable land. There was a huge dust storm, or the storm that that lasted months and months and months, And so people became very poor and then had to leave those areas because there was just no good land anymore to make an income off of. So this is again where the world's arable land is threatened with decline from soil erosion, loss of nutrients, water scarcity, salinization, and poor drainage, right? And so all these things come because of a change in climate. Okay, let's go ahead and hop into the decline in biodiversity. So diversity, we all know that word, right, over the last year. But what is biodiversity? The same thing about race, but when we come to we're talking about a variety of species. So biodiversity is the number and variety of species and the range of their genetic makeup. So scientists estimate that species extinction is occurring at 1 to 1,000 times the normal background rate due to pollution and habitat destruction. Genetic diversity is vital to each species' ability to adapt and survive and has many benefits for human society as well. And a leading cause of this, maybe you've heard of this, maybe you haven't, depends if you've been to Latin America, most likely the destruction of rainforests, right? Rainforests, we think of Costa Rica, we think of Ecuador, Nicaragua, the tropics. So the reason for destruction of rainforests includes commercial logging, as I mentioned already, cutting down trees to make paper products, cattle ranching to make beef, and the conversion of forests to plantations to produce cash crops. So taking down forests to plant other things like coffee or other corn or whatever other type of crop that is more profitable than producing and growing trees, because trees take a long time to grow. Okay, so that is the decline in biodiversity. Let's talk about the Convention on Biological Diversity. Again, another thing that the US has not gotten involved in. So by 2018, it had been ratified by all UN members except the US. Again, this might change now with the Biden administration, but at the moment, the US is not a part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. But this commits these countries to draw up national strategies for conservation. It protects the ecosystems and individual species, and you can take steps to restore the degraded areas. It also allows countries to share in the profits from sales and products derived from their biological resources. So a really nice way to come together and produce for all. Great, let's go ahead and hop into the last global problem. This is the threat to marine ecosystems. This is one of my favorites because my cousin and she was the maid of honor in my wedding. So I don't have any brothers or sisters, but she is my closest, to quote, sibling, and she is a toxicologist for the Navy. And so what she does is she's based in Honolulu, and she is passionate about protecting the coral reefs. So that's where this comes in, right? Key threats to decline of coral reefs because of the pollution. And so whenever she uses sunscreen, for example, she uses particular sunscreen that doesn't hurt the coral. So pollution, it can be from sunscreen, it can be from boats, from oil, it can be from lots of different things, but somehow we're seeing a decline of coral reefs. So what are threats to the marine ecosystem? This is oceans, salt marshes, lagoons, and tidal zones that border them, as well as diverse communities of the life that they support. Salt water covers 70% of the Earth's surface and supports many species, right? So again, coming back to the Bible or evolution or all these different theories about how the Earth was created, hope you remember that 70% of the Earth is salt water. So we have a lot of species that are living there and a lot of things that we depend on. So before we get to coral reefs, there's the exploitation of fish populations, which we spoke about already in this chapter, right? So much fishing, and the fish can't reproduce fast enough. And we are lacking on the types and different, and the different types of fish and the upset of the whole ecosystem, the whole chain of the fish population. Decline of coral reefs, as I mentioned, the coastal development in ecologically fragile areas, that includes California. If you ever go to build a house or renovate your house within a mile of the coast of California, I think it's just a mile, it might even be a handful of miles, you have to get your project approved, even if you're just renovating your kitchen for the most part. You have to get your project approved by the California Coastal Commission. And this Coastal Commission, as I know because I just renovated a house 2 years ago, took about 9 months to approve my plans because they go through the plans with a fine-tooth comb. They want to make sure that any type of renovation, any type of construction project happening close to the California coast will not affect affect the coast in a bad way environmentally, right? So really important. And so for many of you, many of you will do some construction projects within the coast, within the area within the coast of California, and that's where the California Coastal Commission comes into play. Ocean acidification. So this is where we talk about where seawater absorbs carbon dioxide and destroys the sea life. So yeah, that's also a big thing where the seawater is getting too much carbon dioxide. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide, the response of the international business community. So again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this chapter, why do you care, right? You're going to go into business and you're not going to become a toxicologist, potentially. You're not going to work for the Navy. You don't necessarily need to worry about the coral reefs in your day-to-day, but you do. Because organizations, as it says here, the international business community plays a critical role in addressing the ecological challenges. Numerous voluntary initiatives are being undertaken by companies around the world to put the principle of sustainable development into practice. So this is where we talk about the ethical decision, right? It's the right thing to do in a lot of situations. Right? So you might necessarily think that chopping down trees in Ecuador would be great for your paper company, but is that the right thing to do without replanting trees or finding a way to replace those CO2 emissions? Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide. We're going to talk about some voluntary business initiatives. So how can you, as a business manager, get involved? The first is a life cycle analysis. This is also called cradle to grave. And a good example of this is how Tide created Tide cold water. So instead of having to use hot water to get your clothes really clean, which takes more energy, they created a product that worked particularly well with just cold water. So now you can save energy and use just a different product. Usually that's the same price, but it's called Tide Cold Water. And so the life cycle analysis, it involves collecting information on a lifelong environmental impact of a product from extraction of raw material to manufacturing to its distribution, use, and ultimate disposal, right? And so it's talking all about this particular soap, and also how when it goes through this life cycle, the soap, it also doesn't harm the environment as well. So the soap doesn't leave any residue in the water that gets drained out of your washing machine. Okay, let's talk about the industrial ecology. This refers to designing factories and distribution systems as if they were self-contained ecosystem. So this is all about recycling within a factory, right? So if you have extra of a particular product, then you send it back, or you get broken pieces, you send it back and it gets recycled and used again. A really cool idea, because you are using those products. It just needs to be refashioned or reused in a different way. This is the last one here is extended product responsibility. This occurs when companies take continuing responsibility for the environmental impact of the products and services even after they're sold. So the car company Renault, we don't have Renault in the United States, but it's a very popular car company abroad. It's a French company. And what they do is, because the French are very much into the environment, they remanufacture engines, transmissions, and injection pumps. And so if you have an old Renault, you can bring back these parts, and they remanufacture them. So they somehow bring them back to life and put them into new cars, which is a really cool idea, so that they don't have to get new steel and hardware and whatever that they need to make these engines, transmissions, and injection pumps. rubber, probably, right? So if you're into these things, you might want to think about buying Renault if you ever live abroad. Okay, carbon neutrality. An organization or individual produces net zero emission of greenhouse gases. This is usually accomplished by a combination of energy efficiency and carbon offsets. So this is what I alluded to briefly earlier, where a company will pay to plant trees, for example, if they're not removing enough carbon dioxide from the environment in their normal operations. Okay, technology cooperation. This is sustainable development through long-term partnerships between companies in developed and developing countries to transfer environmental technologies. An example that I liked that I read in the book was about Microsoft, and this is where they spent $50 million to share their expertise in artificial intelligence, AI, with countries around the world, including Africa and less developed countries, right? And so they're cooperating with their technology, and they have these long-term partnerships between these different companies, between developed and developing countries, to help them. So let's go ahead and jump into the next slide. The last slide of chapter 9 are all about codes of environmental conduct. And as I started this chapter, I said, as a manager, you'll want to be a little bit familiar with what these codes are, at least the name. So when someone speaks to it, you can reference that. So some of the leading universal codes include the following. First, the Business Charter for Sustainable Development. This is developed by the International Chamber of Commerce. Some of you or some of your parents might be part of the Chamber of Commerce. It's a very old and very interesting and powerful group here in the United States. We also have the CERS Principles. This is developed for the Coalition for the Environmentally Responsible Economies. ISO 14000, this is a really popular one. If you ever work in the construction industry, you will hear this time and time again. And this is a series of voluntary standards developed by the ISO, an international group, happens to be based in Switzerland. They're all about accuracy. But it's the idea that we try and work up to these environmental standards and ideas. And again, Switzerland, like France, is very, very focused on the environment. If you ever live in Switzerland, you'll learn that putting out your garbage every day is like a small science, they call it, because you have to obviously separate your recyclables, but you also then have to separate your newspapers, go in a different one, and your magazines go in a different one. And then you take your recyclables and you have to bring them and separate them into the green glass and the brown glass. And the main garbage that you put into the dumpster or the trash can that gets picked up by the garbage truck, you have to put a sticker on it that you buy at the grocery store, and that these stickers then attribute that garbage to you. And if they find garbage bags without stickers, so you just like don't pay for the sticker and you just throw your garbage into the thing, they will open up your garbage and look for something that is identifiable to you and track you down and give you a large fine for not paying for your garbage. And so it's a really, and if they open up those bags and they find things in there that are recyclables, etc., then it's also a huge fine. So just a side little thing, but an example of how Switzerland and many of these European countries really take these environmental initiatives really very, very seriously. Feel free to ask me more questions about living in Switzerland at any time. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol, this helps businesses measure and manage their greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, many executives are championing the idea that corporations have moral obligations to future generations. And as I started this chapter again, right, that whether you're going to have children or not, the whole idea is that our future generations, our children, our grandchildren will have a place to live that has clean water, has clean air, has an ecosystem that is functional and that works. And so the last thing that I want to leave you with is the equator principles, because again, this is another thing that I thought was really cool, where because a lot of you will go into banking, that the equator principles are where banks will only lend money to projects that have plans in place to mitigate any environmental impacts. And this was, the equator principles were created in 2003. So again, potentially might work for banking. You might hear of the equator principles, and now you know what they are. So again, I'm Professor Green. This was chapter 9. Thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you all in class. Have a great day.